The kitchen clock ticked its soft, rhythm slow, deliberate. The sound of time passing without judgment. Margaret Sullivan sat at her small oak table near the window, where light pooled like warm milk over the wood. The sun filtered through the lace curtain, painting dappled patterns on her lap as she leaned forward with careful focus. A bright felt bird lay across a square of muslin in front of her half-sewn, its little yellow wings curling upward from the body like it was trying to take off. She guided the needle through the soft fabric, her fingers moving slowly but surely. Each stitch was tiny, nearly invisible. Tucked into the blue felt like a secret, humming to herself something tuneless and gentle. The kind of sound that only ever happened when she forgot anyone might hear. She tilted her head slightly to inspect the alignment of the wings. The left one was perfect. The right one maybe a bit too high. Jason would notice. He noticed everything. Her lips pulled into a quiet smile. A cup of tea sat beside her, mostly cold. She didn't mind. The room smelled faintly of lemon balm and laundry detergent, and outside the open window, a neighbor's wind chimes rattled half-heartedly in the breeze. A note sat on the table, folded neatly in half. Jason, 7 p.m. school auditorium. She'd written it that morning so she wouldn't forget. As if she ever would. Margaret's shoulders straightened as she gave the bird one final stitch and tied off the thread. She held it in her hands and turned it gently from side to side, inspecting her work. It wasn't perfect, but it was made with courage, a kind of old, steady love that didn't have to be loud to be strong. She reached for a small tin on the shelf and pulled out a length of ribbon, pale green satin. She threaded it through the top seam of the bird and tied a small loop, meant to be worn around the wrist or hung on a hook backstage. Jason had been cast as a woodland scout. He didn't quite understand what that meant, but he told her. He thought a bird made sense because scouts watch things, and birds can see everything from up top. She'd promised him she'd bring it that night. The needle slid back into its cushion. The tin closed with a soft click. Margaret folded the bird into a small piece of white tissue, then placed it beside her purse on the hallway table. She looked at the clock again. 3:12 p.m., still early, but not too early to be excited. She walked to the sink to rinse her teacup, pausing only once to glance over her shoulder at the felt bird, at the neat hallway, at the light falling just right across the linoleum floor. Everything was in its place. Everything was ready. Margaret dried, her hands slowly folding the towel into neat quarters before hanging it back on the stove handle. The light outside had shifted a deeper gold now, stretching longer across the kitchen floor, catching the corners of the framed photo near the door. Jason at 4, cheeks puffed and red. Holding a watering can upside down, she stared at the picture for a moment, her smile faint but real. Then she walked to the hallway table, picked up the phone from its charger, and pressed her son's number from memory. 1, ring. 2.3, Ethan Sullivan, came the clipped voice, firm and businesslike. Background noise, faint keyboard clicks. Distant chatter. Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom. A pause. She heard a door close on his end, likely stepping into some office hallway. Hey, what's going on? Everything all right? Oh yes, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to make sure I have the time right for the play tonight. It starts at 7, doesn't it? Another pause. This one longer. Mom, listen. Margaret's eyes flicked toward the tissue-wrapped bird still resting by her purse. Yes, Ethan exhaled. It wasn't frustration, more like bracing. I think maybe it's better if you skip this one. She blinked. What? I mean, Jason's in a background role. Mom, he's a tree or a scout or something. I don't even know. He's hardly on stage, and it's one of those chaotic parent night things. Crowded, noisy, not worth the trouble, really. Margaret stood completely still, one hand on the table edge. I don't mind the crowd. I thought I could just sit near the back. Ethan's tone shifted, lowered. It's not just about the crowd. He hesitated, then added, with the kind of flat finality only grown sons can manage. Jason's at that age where he gets self-conscious, you know? I just think maybe having you there might be more of a distraction than a help. Margaret said nothing. I'm not trying to be mean, he added quickly. I'm just trying to make this easy for him. She lowered the phone slowly, just enough to steady her breath, then lifted it again. No, I understand. You sure? Yes, she said softly. All right, good. Look, I'll let you know how it goes. I'll send a video or something. Margaret nodded, though he couldn't see it, of course. Thanks, Mom. I appreciate you being understanding. The line clicked. Call ended. Margaret stood in the silence that followed, longer than she needed to, longer than she realized. She didn't move, didn't sigh, didn't cry. Then she reached out and picked up the felt bird and walked it slowly back into the kitchen. The tissue made the softest sound as Margaret unwrapped it, a hush, like breath through paper. She laid the felt bird flat on the counter and gently folded its ribbon underneath it. Her fingers moved slowly, almost reverently, as if closing the wings of something still alive. She didn't look at its crooked wing this time, just the quiet little face. The soft blue stitching dot. Then she walked it to the cabinet near the pantry, second drawer down. The one where she kept clean napkins, unused dishcloths, and a set of candle holders she hadn't used since Bill's last birthday. She placed the bird inside, between a stack of linen placemats and a holiday tin with no lid. Then closed the drawer with both hands. The click of the latch echoed more than it should have. Outside, footsteps scraped against the pavement. Then a voice, chipper and half-shouted, "Maggie? Helen?" Margaret stepped quickly toward the screen door and opened it halfway. Helen stood at the fence, still in her gardening gloves, holding a plastic bag of seed packets. "I figured you'd be getting dressed for the big show," she called. "What time you heading over?" Margaret forced a smile that felt too wide. "I'm not, actually. I decided not to go." Helen froze for a second, halfway through flipping a packet in her hand. "Really?" Margaret nodded. "I thought it might be better if I didn't. Jason's nervous. I think having me there might make it worse." Helen squinted at her. "He's 11? Not on trial?" "I know," Margaret said quickly. "It's just better this way." There was a beat of silence. Helen, to her credit, didn't press. She just gave a half shrug and tapped the fence post with her finger. "Well, I've got some oregano seed that won't plant itself. If you want to sneak over later and steal a cupcake from the bake table, I'll swear I saw nothing." Margaret chuckled faintly. "Thanks, Helen." The screen door clicked shut behind her. She turned off the kitchen light even though the room was still bright. Then walked to the fridge, opened it, and pulled out a half container of soup homemade from earlier in the week, chicken and barley. She poured it into a small saucepan and set it on the burner as it heated. She sat at the table, listening to the tiny bubbling sound and the occasional far-off squeal of children playing in someone else's yard. It wasn't quiet, it was hollow, like something should be echoing in it but wasn't. The soup simmered with a soft gurgle. Margaret stirred it absent-mindedly, not because it needed it, but because stillness felt too sharp. Steam rose slowly in the kitchen air, curling in the light like something trying to disappear. She watched it for a while, then turned off the burner and ladled the soup into her smallest white bowl, the one with the shallow chip under the rim. She didn't bother with bread, or garnish, or music at the table. She folded a paper napkin once, then again, until it sat like a pressed envelope beside her spoon. Her first bite was too hot, but she didn't wince. She just swallowed slowly and kept eating as though it might warm more than her throat across the room. The television flickered low with the evening news. She hadn't meant to leave it on. A smiling anchor filled the screen beside a banner. "Local school celebrates spring showcase." The camera cut to a group of children in cardboard costumes rehearsing on a taped-off gymnasium stage. A girl spun in butterfly wings. A boy in a bear mask stumbled into the curtain. Laughter, parents clapping. Margaret stared at the screen. Her fingers rested on the spoon. Then she reached for the remote and pressed mute. A second later, she changed the channel entirely. Something about weather patterns took its place. The bowl of soup went half-finished outside. The wind picked up. The light in the room faded slowly, like it was deciding whether to leave or stay. Margaret didn't turn on a lamp. She let the gray settle. Raindrops began tapping softly against the kitchen window. She stood, brought her bowl to the sink, and ran the tap. Not because she was ready to clean, just because the sound helped. The water from the faucet slowed to a trickle, then stopped. Margaret set the rinsed bowl upside down on the drying rack and dried her hands on the same towel she'd folded earlier that afternoon, now wrinkled, now real. Outside, the rain had steadied into a soft, rhythmic hush, tapping on the windows and the roof like distant footsteps returning home. She didn't go back to the living room. Instead, she turned toward the hallway. It was dim there, the kind of light that made familiar objects look like shadows wearing familiar coats. And one coat in particular, it still hung by the door. Dark wool, a little worn at the collar, slightly hunched over the hanger. The shoulders, now sloping, like time had reshaped them. She hadn't moved it. Not in the years since Bill passed. Not once. Sometimes, in the dead quiet of the house, she imagined that coat exhaled, that it sagged not from gravity, but from a man letting go. At the end of a long day, she reached out and laid her fingers along the sleeve. It was cool to the touch, even in spring. Her thumb brushed a threadbare patch near the elbow, a spot she used to tease him about. "You'll wear that coat straight into summer," she had said once. "You'll sweat to death just to prove a point." His answer had been the same. He always gave better to sweat than to shiver. It had never meant anything. Not really. But somehow, now it felt like prophecy. She closed her eyes. Not for drama, just for the silence behind them. She stood there for a long time, not thinking, not moving. Just being a body in a hallway near a coat that once belonged to someone who made her feel like the world didn't need permission to include her. When she opened her eyes, the hallway was the same. Still dim, still narrow, dots still hers, and still empty. The hallway floor creaked faintly under her steps. As Margaret moved back toward the living room, her fingers still tingling from the memory woven into wool, she didn't bother turning on the light. The windows glowed dimly with the storm-gray dusk outside, and the room felt softer in shadow. Then the phone rang. The sound was sharp, too loud against the hush of the rain and the hum of an untouched house. Margaret froze mid-dash step once, twice. She stared at the cordless phone on its charger by the armchair. 3 times 4, she didn't move. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because she was suddenly sure that whatever waited on the other end was not ordinary. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed felt louder than the sound. Then came the small, mechanical chirp. From the answering machine, a faint beep, and a voice. Margaret moved toward the machine like approaching an unfamiliar animal, half hopeful, half afraid to startle it. The red message light blinked once. She pressed play. There was a pause, a quiet breath. Then, Margaret. Hey, it's Danny. Danny Tran. Her breath caught. I know it's been a while. A long while. I got a letter from the VA about Bill, some memorial thing. Made me think of you. A pause. Faint rustling in the background. I should have called sooner. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me. She sat slowly on the edge of the couch, one hand covering her mouth. I'm still out. In Illyria? Fixing bikes? Teaching a few kids how not to kill themselves with a wrench? Same old. Anyway, I was thinking I could stop by, catch up, if that's okay. If not, no pressure. Just, I don't know. You came to mind. Another pause. Shorter, almost embarrassed. You don't have to call back, but I'll be passing through tomorrow. Thought I'd try my luck. Click. End of message. The room was still. Margaret sat with both hands in her lap now, staring at the blank screen of the answering machine outside. The rain slowed. She didn't move, but the light in her eyes somewhere behind all that stillness had changed. Morning broke without ceremony. A low-hanging sky lingered over the street, thick with cloud and cool light. The rain had stopped, but the earth still smelled of damp mulch, wet pavement. The faint copper of dewed grass. Margaret stood by the window in her living room, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. She wore a clean blouse and slacks. Nothing fancy, just something that didn't feel like yesterday. She'd replayed the message twice more before bed, never letting it echo too loud, like if she played it softly enough it might remain a dream. At 8:07, a truck pulled up across the street, faded red, a little rust on the wheel wells. Margaret watched through the curtain without moving. The door opened. Danny Tran stepped out. He was older than she remembered, but not by much. His shoulders were still square, his walk still measured. His hair was mostly silver now, cut short around the ears. A deep line ran down from each side of his nose to the corners of his mouth. Like old smiles had etched themselves into place whether he liked it or not. He carried no umbrella, no flowers, just a Navy veteran's cap folded in one hand, and something unreadable in his eyes. Margaret opened the door before he reached it. They stood there for a moment. Not awkward, not rushed, just present. Danny gave her a small nod. Hey, Margaret. Danny. He looked down at the cap in his hand, then back up at her. I wasn't sure if you'd be home. I live here, she said simply. A slow smile spread across his face. Still the same. She stepped back slightly, holding the door open. He didn't enter right away. He looked at her again, more carefully this time. You doing all right? Margaret hesitated just a beat then. I've been better. And worse. He nodded. The air between them shifted like it had just let out a breath. It didn't know it was holding. I know I'm late, Danny said. I should have come sooner. Should have. Margaret agreed, but without bite. He rubbed the back of his neck. I figured maybe if you weren't too busy with your disappearing act, we could talk a while. Her eyes narrowed slightly, amused. I never disappeared. I just went quiet. Well, he said, holding up his cap like a peace offering. I came to interrupt the quiet. Margaret looked at him full and long. Then, without another word, stepped aside. Danny crossed the threshold, not like a guest, but like someone. Returning to a house that remembered him, the door clicked shut behind them. The smell of weak coffee filled the kitchen, joined by the soft tick of the wall clock and the occasional creak of Danny's chair as he shifted his weight. He sat across from Margaret, hands wrapped around a plain white mug, like it was something steadier than he felt. She hadn't offered cream. He hadn't asked. You still drink it this bad? He said, eyeing the liquid like it had wronged him. Margaret smirked faintly. Some things don't need fixing. He raised an eyebrow. That's an Ohio lie, and you know it. She stirred her tea without answering. The spoon clinked once, then she set it down. It had been 15 minutes since they sat down. They had covered the weather, the new stoplight in town, and the hardware store that had finally closed after 40 years. Not one mention of Bill. Margaret watched the steam curl from her mug before finally saying, "You drove in this morning?" "Left. At 5, thought I'd beat traffic. And my nerves did it work." Half and half, Margaret gave a small nod. "That's better odds than usual." They sat in silence again, but it wasn't hostile, just ... loaded. Like neither of them wanted to open the real conversation until they'd proven they still remembered how to talk at all. Danny leaned back, his chair creaking beneath him. "I almost turned around," he said. Margaret looked at him when, about 2 miles from the county line, there's that bend where the trees hang over the road like they're listening. Thought maybe it'd be easier to keep going past town. Just drive till gas told me to stop. "And what made you stop here?" Danny looked at her, not long, not intensely. "Just enough, you answered the phone." Margaret didn't smile, but something softened in her shoulders. She looked around the kitchen, eyes landing briefly on the drawer where the felt bird still slept. Then back at him. "I didn't expect." "Your voice," she said. Danny's fingers drummed against the side of the mug. "I didn't expect to use it." They sat there, 2 older bodies in a house that remembered them younger. The kitchen was the same size it had always been, but it had taken on the feel of a stage. Every pause was a cue. Every look was a line held back. Then Danny reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tin. "Still keep sugar cubes?" he asked. Margaret blinked. "Where did you even find that?" "Old gas station in Elyria. Still sells candy like it's 1982. He slid the tin across the table. She opened it. 3 cubes. They each took one. They dropped them into their cups like a truce. And for a little while, that was enough. Danny opened the hallway closet looking for an umbrella, but the moment the door creaked open, his body went still. There, it was tucked just behind a pale raincoat and a knitted scarf. Bill's army field jacket, olive drab, softened by time, a little sagged at the shoulders. Still there, still waiting. He didn't reach for it right away. Just looked. Margaret came up behind him, drying her hands on a dish towel. "It's in the back, behind the green umbrella." She stopped when she saw him. Danny turned slowly. "You kept it." "I kept a lot of things," she said. He slid the jacket from the hanger and held it in both hands, thumbs hooked under the collar like muscle memory. "I haven't seen this in 40 years, he said. Last time, he had it balled up as a pillow under his neck, sleeping in a truck bed with his boots still on. Margaret's voice was quiet. "He used to wear it when he couldn't sleep." Danny nodded, eyes still on the coat. "I remember." He turned it over. One sleeve was fraying near the cuff. The patch on the shoulder had faded, his fingers found. A tear in the lining he hadn't known about. Or maybe he had. And forgotten. Margaret leaned against the wall, arms crossed loosely. After he came home, he wore it like armor. Not for warmth. Just so he'd have something between himself and the house. Danny didn't speak for a moment. Then, "Did he ever talk to you?" "About what happened?" "Bits," she said. "In pieces." "Sometimes in sleep." Danny looked up. She went on slowly. "He used to stand in the garage at night. Just stand there, staring at the floor like it owed him something. One night I found him gripping a wrench so tight he couldn't open his hand. Said it made him feel safe." Danny nodded again. "He told me once the silence at home was louder than the noise over there." "I know." He folded the jacket gently over his arm and stared at it for a moment longer. Then he looked at her. "You know, I used to think he made it home because of me." Margaret raised an eyebrow, "And I was wrong. He made it home because of you." "I just followed." She didn't speak. He held the jacket a little tighter. "I never said it, but you held us both together. Not just him. Me too." Margaret stepped forward, her hand brushing the edge of the coat. Her eyes moved between Danny and the fabric between. "2 men tied to one wound." "Then you should have come sooner," she said. Danny didn't flinch. "I know." The rain had slowed to a mist. The back porch glistened faintly where puddles clung to the edges of the railing, and the wind had that clean scent of earth and concrete washed bare. Margaret poured 2 mugs of fresh coffee and handed one to Danny. As they stepped outside, she sat in the rocking chair. He took the bench. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was purposeful. A space held open, not yet filled. Danny took a sip, then leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "You remember Saigon?" he asked. Margaret looked at him, only from what Bill told me, and what he didn't. Danny gave a quiet snort. "Yeah, that tracks." He stared out at the garden, but his eyes were miles away. "We were down by a checkpoint, Bill and me. And this kid named Martinez, just 19, still had acne under his helmet. We were waiting for transport back after a patrol. One of those sweaty, slow afternoons where every sound felt like a threat. Margaret didn't interrupt. She just listened. There was this little boy, Danny continued. Couldn't have been more than 10, walked right past the guards. We thought he was lost, but he wasn't. He was sent. He paused, took a long breath. He had wires under his shirt. Margaret closed her eyes, but not hard. Danny looked down at his hands. Martinez grabbed him before Bill could get to him. Kid panicked. Whole thing went fast. Too fast. I still don't remember hearing the blast. Just the dirt hitting my face. Martinez didn't survive. Silence. A robin chirped in the garden like it hadn't heard a thing. Bill wouldn't talk about that, Danny said. Not to anyone. But it was the day something broke in him. Not just grief, guilt. That we made it and that kid didn't? That he couldn't stop it? That none of us could? Margaret held her mug with both hands. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. He came home with a whole body, but not a whole heart. Danny nodded. Yeah, and I came home thinking if I stayed away from you, I wouldn't have to carry his pieces too. She looked at him now. Not as Bill's friend. Not as a soldier, just as a man sitting in the rain-soft morning, trying to set something down after too many years. Holding it, I'm sorry, he added. Margaret's voice was quiet. You should be, but she didn't rise, didn't recoil. She just sat beside him and listened because that, too, was a kind of forgiveness. The sidewalk through downtown was cracked in places but clean, with faded chalk drawings still clinging to the edges from last week's festival. Margaret and Danny walked side by side slowly, not from age but from the kind of ease only found between two people with nothing to prove. The town hadn't changed much. The hardware store still had an outdated going out of business sign, even though it never fully closed. The florist's windows were cluttered with fake peonies and sun-bleached ribbon. The diner sat at the corner of Maple and 3rd, just like it always had. Margaret paused before the door. I haven't eaten here in years, she said. Danny opened the door for her. Time for a bad sandwich and worse coffee. Then inside, the air smelled of fried onions and too much bleach. Vinyl booths lined the walls, half occupied by the late lunch crowd. A jukebox blinked softly near the back. Though no one fed at quarters anymore, they took a booth near the window. Brenda, the same waitress from decades ago, shuffled over with a pad and a tired smile. Well, if it isn't Danny Tran, she said, you haven't aged a bit. Still walk like you're carrying something heavy. Danny grinned. It's just regret and bad knees. Brenda laughed and turned to Margaret. And look at you. Thought maybe you'd moved away. I didn't, Margaret said, folding her hands. I just stayed quiet. Brenda gave a polite smile, took their orders, grilled cheese, to coffees and walked off. As they waited, another voice called out from a nearby booth. Margaret Sullivan. She turned to see Richard Blake, her former neighbor. White mustache, pressed flannel, still wore a high school ring that barely fit. Haven't seen you in ages, he said. We figured maybe you disappeared after Bill passed. Danny turned his head. Calm but deliberate. She didn't disappear, he said. The town just stopped looking. Richard raised both hands. No offense meant, just hadn't seen her around. Danny smiled politely. You just said the quiet part loud. Richard chuckled, awkward now, and turned back to his paper. Margaret looked down at her folded napkin. That's what people think, she said. That I vanished. Danny sipped his coffee and set it down. That's what people say when someone stops orbiting their lives. Doesn't mean you left. Just means they didn't check the backyard. Margaret glanced out the window. A boy walked past with a balloon tied to his wrist, tugged forward by a younger sister in untied sneakers. Maybe I stopped expecting them to, she said. Danny nodded. Maybe they're not the ones worth expecting. The food arrived. Neither of them touched it for a while. Margaret sliced her grilled cheese into neat halves, the blade of her knife scraping softly against the plate. She didn't lift it to eat, just kept her fingers resting lightly on the edges, as though holding something fragile. Danny chewed thoughtfully, eyes scanning the diner like it might explain something. Near the counter, two women stood ordering pie to go. One of them glanced toward. Margaret whispered something to the other, then turned away. Margaret didn't flinch. Danny leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. You ever notice how people look at you when they don't know? How do you look at you? She gave him a sideways glance. I stopped keeping score. They squint, he said. Like distance might change the story. Margaret let the corners of her mouth twitch upward, almost a smile outside the window. The street moved in slow motion. A postal worker dropped a bundle of mail into the box on the corner. A girl in a hoodie leaned against the ice cream parlor, head down in her phone. A man with a stroller crossed toward the library. Danny stirred his coffee. The spoon clinked. Once, they don't know what you carried, he said. Margaret's eyes didn't leave the window. He went on, voice quieter. They don't know how many nights you sat up with Bill after a bad spell, or how many times you calmed him down without ever calling anyone. How many letters you kept from Jason because Bill couldn't stand to read about real life while his wasn't moving. She didn't interrupt. And they sure as hell don't know you made it through all that and still showed up every Sunday, like your hair wasn't graying faster than it should have. Now she looked at him. That's a nice speech, she said, tone mild. Danny shrugged. You deserve to hear it. I'm not a hero, Danny. I was just there. Exactly. Margaret's fork hovered over her plate for a moment, then lowered. I used to think staying quiet made me strong, she said, voice thin, but all it did was make me invisible. Danny leaned back in the booth, arms folded now. Well, he said, you're not invisible to me. The streetlight outside clicked on early, casting a soft amber glow through the diner window. Margaret's reflection hovered faintly in the glass beside Danny's two older faces lined by time, shadowed by things they'd shared and things they hadn't. She took a bite of her sandwich. He said nothing else, and in the silence, something settled between them that neither needed to name. The gravel crunched softly underfoot as Margaret and Danny stepped into the nearly empty parking lot behind the diner. The sun had dropped low behind a bank of clouds, casting a pale, bruised light over the parked cars. Margaret's sedan waited near the far corner, where a sagging maple leaned over the fence. She paused beside the driver's side, unlocking the door but not getting in. Danny stuffed his hands in his coat pockets and rocked once on his heels. That wasn't the worst grilled cheese I've had. Your bar is low, still counts. They stood a moment longer, the quiet around them less strained, now just a natural resting silence, the kind that comes when neither person wants to leave first but both know they should. Then headlights swung in from the alley. Margaret turned slightly as the dark SUV rolled into the lot and parked 2 spaces away. The driver's door opened and Ethan stepped out, sleeves rolled, phone in hand. He hesitated when he saw them, adjusted his posture, walked over slowly. Mom, he said, voice flat. Ethan, Margaret replied. He nodded at Danny. Didn't realize you were back in town? Didn't announce it, Danny said easily. Ethan gave a faint, polite smile. His eyes returned to Margaret. I just came to drop off Jason's science project. He left it in the back seat yesterday. Margaret nodded. That's nice of you. Ethan shifted his weight, like something under his skin itched. You were at the diner? We were with Danny. Yes. Ethan's brow twitched. You know people talk. Danny's jaw moved slightly. They always have. Ethan ignored him. Just be mindful, Mom. It's a small town. People remember things, and not all of them fondly. Margaret tilted her head, unreadable. And what do you remember? Ethan paused. That's not the point. Margaret took a step closer. Not aggressive. Not warm. Just enough. I'm not the one hiding anything, Ethan, and I'm not embarrassed to be seen. He opened his mouth, closed it. Then, Jason's at a weird age. He doesn't understand all this history. I'm just trying to keep things simple for him. Margaret smiled softly. Children understand more than we admit. You're the one who wants things simple. Jason just wants truth. Danny folded his arms. Ethan looked between them, his mother calm, his father's old friend silent but solid, and something in his eyes faltered. I'll see you later, he muttered, stepping back toward his car. Margaret didn't move. She just watched him go. When the engine rumbled and the SUV backed out, Danny let out a low whistle. Well, he still carries a lot of his father. Margaret looked toward the road. He never noticed the parts worth carrying. Danny didn't respond. He just walked her the rest of the way to the car. And this time, he opened the door for her, not because she needed help, but because she didn't. The porch creaked beneath their feet as Margaret stepped out with a blanket draped over one arm and 2 fresh cups of tea, balanced carefully in hand. Danny was already seated, elbows on knees, watching the sky shift above the rooftops. The horizon was purple-gray now, the color of old bruises and quieter endings. Margaret handed him a cup, then sat in the rocking chair beside him. She tucked the blanket around her legs, careful not to let it drag. They didn't speak at first. The stillness between them was no longer full of things unsaid, was simply full, like a held breath, like peace, if you knew what it cost. Danny cradled the tea, let the steam rise into his face, then set it down on the side table without taking a sip. I should have been there, he said. Margaret didn't answer. I told Bill, he went on the night before his last deployment, that if anything ever happened to him, if he ever lost the thread, I'd be there. For him? For you? She turned her head slightly. Danny's voice stayed level, but I wasn't. I stayed gone. Figured he wouldn't want the reminder. Figured you wouldn't either. Margaret watched the houses across the street. I would have sent you away probably. At first, I know. She exhaled through her nose. Not quite a sigh. Not forgiveness. I kept that promise in my head, Danny said. Even if I didn't keep it out loud, a breeze rustled the branches in the yard. Somewhere down the block, a screen door slammed, and a dog barked once. I'm not asking you for anything, he said finally. Not pity, not a second chance. Margaret rocked once, then stilled. Then what are you asking? Danny looked at her, face lined by light and time and something older than both. I'm asking to keep the promise now. She blinked slowly, eyes never leaving his. He added, almost under his breath, whatever you'll let me carry, I will. For a long moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she reached for her tea, took one small sip, and said, then sit with me. Danny nodded, and he did. The doorbell rang just after noon. Margaret was in the back room sorting linens she hadn't touched in months, some of them still smelling faintly of cedar and lemon soap. She wiped her hands on her pants, walked slowly to the front door, and opened it. Helen stood on the porch, her hair pulled into a loose bun, floral blouse tucked unevenly into her jeans. In her hand an envelope. Afternoon, she said brightly, but with something tucked behind it. Margaret raised an eyebrow. That's your play voice. You rehearsing something? Helen smiled and held out the envelope. I grabbed an extra ticket from Mrs. Enderby. You know how they sell out at the door. Figured. Well, just in case. Margaret didn't take it. I thought you were going with your sister. I am, Helen said. 2 rows behind the PTA herd. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't come. Nobody said you have to walk in waving a banner. Margaret looked at the envelope like it might bloom into something she wasn't ready for. Helen, didn't press look. I know it's complicated. But Jason will be up there, and maybe it's not about who's watching him. Maybe it's just about showing up for yourself. Margaret's voice was even. He doesn't want me there. Helen's head tilted. He's 11. What he wants changes hourly. But what he remembers that sticks longer than you think. The wind rustled a low chime somewhere behind them. Margaret took the envelope. Helen stepped back, nodded once. If you come late. Nobody watches the door after the 3rd bell rings. Then she turned and walked down the porch steps. Margaret stood in the doorway holding the envelope long after the screen door shut behind her. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she placed it on the entryway table beside her purse, keys, and a basket of loose change. Then she returned to the linen pile, but every few minutes she glanced toward it again like it might move. The sun was starting to lean westward when Margaret stepped into the bedroom and shut the door behind her. She stood in front of the mirror, not to admire, not to analyze, just to look. The reflection was, at first, familiar only in pieces. The same lines around the eyes, some soft, some etched. The same hands, older now, resting at her sides like tired passengers. But the tilt of her head, the way she held her shoulders, it had changed. Not proud, but not invisible either. She opened the wardrobe slowly, fingertips trailing across the fabric, inside like reading Braille for the first time in years. She passed over the usual muted blouses, the cardigan she wore to church, the black wool she kept for funerals. Then she stopped on a blue-gray wrap with faint embroidery at the collar. It was simple. She hadn't worn it since Jason's kindergarten graduation. She slipped it on. It still fit. Looser, but kinder. Somehow, next came the drawer. The one in the pantry cabinet. Second from the bottom, she opened it carefully. As though the felt bird might have flown off in her absence. It hadn't. Still nestled in the tissue paper, ribbon curled neatly under its body. Margaret held it in her hand and brushed a bit of lint. From the corner, the stitching was just as crooked. Just as hers. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Carrying the bird upstairs, she clipped it to the inside of her purse knot, out in the open, but not hidden either. A place where it could wait. Just in case Dottie knocked on her bedroom door an hour later. Thinking of walking down to the VFW, he said, "You need anything?" Margaret opened the door partially. "No, thank you." He looked her over, not her clothes, but her face. There was something unreadable in her stillness, something just a breath to calm. He nodded once. "All right then, I'll be back before dark." She watched him leave through the front window, hands in his pockets, gait steady and square. The moment the door closed, she reached for her keys and the envelope. The school smelled exactly as she remembered: waxed linoleum, cafeteria grease, the faint temps of dry marker ink. A custodian nodded to her as she passed, uninterested, and the squeak of her shoes down the hallway echoed longer than it should have. Margaret walked slowly, not hesitantly, just ... carefully. Like the walls were listening. The auditorium doors stood open. A folding table near the entrance held a crooked cardboard sign. Spring Showcase, tonight only. Beneath it, rows of printed programs, stacked in alternating colors, green, blue, and cream. She took a green one, folded it once, and slipped it into her purse. Inside, the stage was dimly lit. Backdrops of painted trees leaned slightly on their support poles. A crescent moon made of silver foil hung too low on one side, like it was. Bowing chairs were filling in slowly, mostly from the back. Margaret kept her head down as she stepped into the aisle. Her feet moved almost on instinct. Row 3. End seat. Right side. She sat without adjusting her coat, her purse held softly in her lap. From here, the whole stage was clear. Close but not obvious. Present but not central. The chatter around her grew louder as parents filed in. A woman behind her unwrapped candy with the precision of a surgeon. Somewhere off to her left, 2 teachers whispered over a clipboard. No one looked twice at her, not yet, and that was fine. She could see the paper trees sway slightly as a stagehand scurried across backstage. Someone tested a mic asterisk, check 1 2 asterisk, and it popped before going silent. Margaret adjusted the felt bird in her purse, just slightly, its little blue head now visible through the flap. She exhaled once. Steady, the lights began to dim and the curtain creaked open. The first act unfolded with clumsy charm. A paper campfire flickered under an oscillating fan. Children, in green felt tunics, took turns stepping up to wooden stumps, reciting lines that sounded memorized from a script written by someone who loved metaphors just a little too much. Margaret sat still in her chair, hands folded over her purse, eyes fixed on the stage. She didn't blink much, didn't smile unless the kids stumbled in that way only earnest children could. The kind that made you ache a little? Jason came on. Halfway through the act, his uniform looked slightly too big, the belt twisted at the side. A brown paper ranger hat perched atop his head and one sock had slipped just below his calf. He stood stage left, waiting, eyes scanning the crowd. Margaret didn't wave, didn't shift. Then his scene started. 3 kids in animal costumes circled a makeshift tent. Jason stepped forward. His voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat. We gather in the woods, not to be seen, but to... He stopped. Silence. The lights buzzed faintly. An adult in the front row straightened. Jason's shoulders lifted, chest shallow. His fingers curled slightly at his sides. Margaret opened her purse. Not all the way. Just enough to lift the bird. She raised it a few inches above the leather edge held. It's steady, quiet, right where the 3rd row caught the stage light. Jason's eyes moved once across the crowd, and then stopped. He didn't react. Didn't nod. But his breath steadied. We gather in the woods not to be seen but to understand, he said, voice stronger now. To listen and to learn the sounds of silence. His line landed. The animals cheered on cue. The crowd clapped. Softly, and Jason moved back to his mark like nothing had happened. But Margaret lowered the bird gently back into her purse, folding the flap closed with quiet finality. She didn't look around, but she could feel something in the row. Behind her shift, the curtain call was met with soft applause and scattered whoops. From the back of the room, parents with phones raised. Hi, teachers guiding kids into uneven lines for their final bow. Jason stood near the middle, clapping along with the others. His hat slightly askew now, tunic wrinkled at the hem. He looked proud but not overwhelmed. Tired, but lighter somehow. Margaret remained seated until most of the audience had risen. Her hands stayed on her lap. The program folded neatly beside her purse, the bird still tucked just out of sight. Then she stood, slowly. No rush, just movement. As she stepped into the aisle, someone touched her elbow. Mom. Ethan's voice. Neutral, but brittle. She turned. He stood with his jacket slung over one arm, a satchel hanging from his shoulder. Jason wasn't with him, at least not immediately. The crowd buzzed around them. I didn't know you were here, he said. I came late, Margaret replied. Why didn't you tell me? You told me not to come. He shifted his weight. I didn't mean I know what you meant, she said evenly. They stood there, 2 feet apart, but the space between them was years deep. He looked around, perhaps searching for a more private place to speak, but the hallway had already begun to swell with post-play chatter. I was just trying to protect him, he said quietly. Margaret raised her chin from me. Ethan didn't answer. Just then, Jason emerged from behind a cluster of students. Near the classroom door, his face was flushed, sweat drying at his temples. He spotted them. He jogged up. Dad, I left my water bottle in the gym, he said, breathless. Then he saw Margaret. He froze not, startled but caught mid-thought. His eyes moved to her purse, to the slight bulge just beneath the leather fold. He didn't say anything, but his expression shifted. Not joy, not shame. Recognition, double quotes. Hi, Grandma, he said, quieter now. Margaret smiled, small and steady. Hi, sweetheart. Ethan cleared his throat. We need to go. Jason looked at him, then back at her. Okay. He lingered just a second longer before following his father into the crowd as they disappeared. Jason turned, once just briefly, and looked back over his shoulder. No words, just eyes, and Margaret watched him go, her hand gently resting atop the purse like it carried more than cloth and thread. The auditorium was nearly empty. When Jason returned, the teachers had ushered most of the students back to the classrooms to change out of costume. But he'd slipped awake, quiet, deliberate. Without asking, the janitor was already sweeping confetti off the stage. Jason walked down the aisle alone. Third row, right side. He stopped at the seat where she'd been. There, resting neatly against the fold-down back, was the bird. Its blue head poked gently from beneath the edge of the seat, like it had settled there on purpose. He reached down and picked it up. The felt was soft but firm, stitched with care. The thread at the wing was still loose on one side. The ribbon had curled slightly, like it remembered fingers, smoothing it. Jason turned it over in his hands. Behind him, footsteps. 2 boys from his class, Noah and Deshaun, trailed in from the hallway, still half in costume, cheeks smeared faintly with grease paint. "Yo, what's that?" Deshaun asked, pointing. Jason glanced down at the bird. "It's something my grandma made." Noah raised an eyebrow. "It's a bird." Jason nodded. "Yeah, looks handmade." Deshaun added. Jason shrugged. "She does that." The boys didn't tease, didn't laugh, just looked at it a moment longer, then wandered off toward the back doors. Already talking about snacks and missing cupcakes, Jason stood alone again, bird in hand. He looked back toward the seat one last time, then tucked the bird into his jacket pocket, careful not to bend the wing, and walked out of the auditorium without another word. The engine hummed softly in the still evening air. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her coat folded neatly over her lap, hands resting atop it. The headlights glowed dimly against the edge of the school's parking lot. Few cars remained. Danny gripped the wheel, not tightly, just present. His gaze was fixed on the windshield, but he wasn't watching anything outside. He hadn't asked where she'd gone, and Margaret hadn't offered when she'd returned to the house and found him reading quietly at the table. She simply set down her purse and said, "I'd like to go for a drive." He nodded, put on his jacket, and followed. Now they sat there, the two of them, cocooned in the low hum of a car that didn't need to be anywhere else. "I didn't sit in the back," she said after a while. Danny didn't turn. "Third row," she added, close enough to see his face. Still, he didn't look over. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded program, smoothed the crease with her thumb. "He forgot a line," she said, only for a second. Danny finally glanced at her, and I reminded him. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Margaret didn't smile back, but her voice softened. "He looked right at me. He saw me." Danny nodded slowly, as if taking the weight of it. "Did Ethan?" "Yes." Danny raised his eyebrows but didn't ask. Margaret stared out the passenger window, watching her own faint reflection in the glass. He didn't say much, but Jason called me grandma like he meant it. Silence filled the car again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of breath, of noise turned quiet. Of all the moments that didn't need to be explained, Margaret looked down at her hands, then turned her head toward him. "Thank you," she said. Danny met her eyes. "For what?" "For not asking me to explain it all." He shrugged once. "I already knew most of it." Outside, a street lamp buzzed and clicked on, bathing the dashboard in soft amber. Margaret folded the program in half again, gently, then leaned back in her seat. They didn't drive off right away. There was nowhere else they needed to be. The market smelled like sunlight and earthapoles in wooden crates. Tomatoes warmed by the morning air. Bread that still steamed faintly inside its waxed paper sleeves. Margaret stepped onto the gravel lot at precisely 9:17 a.m., her canvas bag folded under one arm, sunglasses perched low on her nose like armor. She hadn't been here since the spring before last. Back then, Bill had still been alive, technically, sitting in his recliner, body present, but voice lost somewhere. Inside himself, she'd run the errands, smiled politely, paid in cash. She hadn't been seen then, not really. Just watched. Today felt different. She walked past the flower stand, nodding once at the older woman arranging zinnias. The woman looked up, paused, then smiled faintly. Margaret returned it. 1 second longer than courtesy. A breeze lifted through the aisle, rustling the tarp canopies above. Somewhere, a kid sneezed. A vendor laughed. Margaret moved toward the produce stall near the corner, her old favorite, Barnes Family Farm. Same faded sign, same crooked table legs. Behind the stand, George Barnes' gray beard, fuller now. Red checkered shirt, tight at the shoulders, was lining up baskets of apples. He looked up when she stepped forward. His face lit up the way people light up when They almost recognize someone but aren't sure if they're right. Well, I'll be, he said. You're still around. Margaret smiled. I am. He reached for a plastic bag, already filling it. Didn't know if you'd moved out of state or what you just ... vanished. I stayed quiet, she said. He handed her the bag. Got some heirlooms, too. Bit soft on the skin, but sweet where it counts. Margaret picked one up, examined it closely. It smelled like home. As she reached for her wallet, George added, You visiting or just passing through? Margaret paused just for a moment, then she looked up. No, she said. I live here. George nodded. The way men do when they're not sure what they said wrong? Margaret handed him the bills. And before she turned to go, she said softly, clearly, I always have. Then she walked off down the row, apples in hand, tomatoes tucked safely in the curve of her bag. Nobody stopped her, but more than a few people looked. The garage smelled of oil, old wood, and something faintly metallic like childhood scraped into rust. Danny was crouched over the frame of a small bike, sleeves rolled, socket wrench in hand. His flannel shirt was speckled with sawdust and grease. The radio in the corner played faintly, some local blues station crackling under static. Margaret stood in the doorway, holding a glass of lemonade. He's not going to ride that if it wobbles, she said. Danny glanced back. Then I guess I better stop pretending I know what I'm doing. She stepped in, handed him the glass. He wiped his hand on a towel and took it. You always this judgmental? Only when I'm impressed, he smirked. That explains a lot. She leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. The afternoon light cut in through the high windows, making stripes on the concrete floor. What made you start this? She asked. Danny took a sip, set the glass on the bench. He mentioned once he wanted to learn how to ride again. Said he fell once and never really tried after that. Margaret tilted her head. And you decided to fix him a bike. He shrugged. Figured he deserved something. That's ready when he is. A long pause settled between them. Then Danny said, Quieter now. He's a smart kid. You can tell he's careful. Not cautious careful. He listens when people think he isn't. Margaret nodded slowly. He always has. Danny turned the bike upright, spun the back wheel gently. It wobbled. Just a little. He's looking for something steady, he said. Not flashy. Just something that doesn't give way when he leans. Margaret watched the wheel turn, then stop. I used to be that, she said. For Bill, for Ethan, for everyone. You still are, Danny said. She shook her head. I don't know what I am anymore. Not to Jason, not to Ethan. Some days I'm not even sure I'm real in my own house. Danny reached for the wrench again. You don't have to be what you were, she looked at him. You just have to show up. Steady's not about never falling, Margaret. It's about not walking away when you do. He tightened the bolt. The wheel spun smoother now, and for the first time all day, Margaret stepped closer to the bike. She touched the seat just once. Lightly that. Then she said, He's going to love it. Danny didn't smile, but the silence that followed was the kind people rest in. The air inside the bank was dry and too cold. The kind of over-air-conditioned space meant to remind you of order, silence, and fluorescent lighting. Margaret stood. In line near the end of the lunch hour, a small envelope tucked under her arm just. Some old bonds she wanted to check on. The kind of errand she used to send Bill on. The kind that made her feel anonymous. 2 customers ahead, 1 behind. Then a voice behind her shoulder. Well, if it isn't Margaret Sullivan, Margaret turned Elaine Cartwright. Still with the big earrings. Still with the pursed smile that barely disguised condescension. Her makeup sat too evenly. Like she'd learned how to hold her face still with age. I thought you moved, Elaine said, stepping forward as though they'd been mid-conversation all along. No one's seen you in forever. You still keeping busy? Margaret looked at her, steady. No. Elaine blinked. Margaret continued, calm as water. I'm learning how to show up again. Elaine gave a short laugh. Well, that's good. I always say staying active keeps the mind young. Margaret didn't reply. She didn't need to. Elaine shifted her bag on her shoulder. You know, people were wondering about you. After, well, you know, some thought maybe you were with your son. Or in assisted living. You never know these days. Margaret offered a small, polite smile. People always wonder. And then, with perfect timing, the teller waved her forward. Margaret stepped ahead, heels quiet on the floor. She didn't look back. The teller greeted her softly. Margaret handed over the envelope, waited as the woman typed. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead when she left the bank 5 minutes later. Margaret didn't walk faster or straighter. She just walked without pausing, and as the glass doors closed behind her, she realized something surprising. Her back didn't ache at all. The late afternoon sun filtered through the front windows, casting slow-moving rectangles of light across the living room floor. Margaret was folding laundry at the table, matching socks and stacking small shirts into careful piles. Jason hovered near the entryway, half in, half out of the room. "Grandma." She looked up, waiting. He stepped in, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. There's this birthday party. For Mason, he's turning 12. There's gonna be pizza and this obstacle course thing in the backyard." Margaret nodded. "Sounds fun." Jason scratched his neck. "It's tomorrow after lunch." Another pause. He looked at her. "Do you want to come?" The question hung in the air. Margaret blinked once, surprised not by the words, but by the way he said them. Like it was a real offer, not just something polite. Then Ethan's voice came from the hallway. "She probably doesn't want to go, buddy." Jason turned. Ethan stepped into the kitchen. Casual, but clearly having heard. Margaret didn't move. Ethan glanced at her, then back at Jason. "It's just a bunch of kids. Loud music. Hot dogs. Not really her thing." Jason hesitated. Looked up at her again. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't try to convince. She simply asked, "Do you want me there?" Jason looked at her for a full second, then nodded, double quotes, "Yes." The room stilled. Ethan opened his mouth. Closed it. Margaret spoke gently. "That's all I need." She folded the last towel, stacked it on the pile, and stood up. Jason smiled, not wide, but real. Ethan stood still in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame. Margaret passed him on the way to the hallway. "I won't be in the way," she said softly, "but I also won't disappear for your comfort." Ethan didn't reply. Not yet. But he didn't stop her, either. The party was loud in all the usual ways, plastic cups clinking, children shrieking through obstacle tunnels, someone's BLUETOOTH speaker playing a song that repeated the chorus too often. Margaret stood near the folding table lined with snacks, sipping ginger ale from a paper cup with a cartoon dragon on it. She'd arrived with Jason, but hadn't hovered. She'd let him go, watching from a distance as he ran toward the others, confidence already blooming in his step. A mother from the neighborhood had nodded politely at her. No one asked who she was. Then someone beside her said, "I hate these cups." Margaret turned. The woman had short silver hair and deep-set laugh lines. She was trying to balance a plate of chips and a can of soda without spilling either. "The rims always fold inward. Makes me feel like I'm drinking out of a sad flower." Margaret smiled. "A real one." "I thought I was the only one who noticed." "Trust me," the woman said, setting her plate down. "We form a quiet club." They stood there a moment, side by side. "I'm Anna," the woman said. "That's my grandson Jamal, the one in the green shirt who just tried to somersault into the cooler." Margaret chuckled. "I saw that. You here for Jason?" Margaret nodded. Anna studied her for a beat, then smiled. "So we're in the same club?" Margaret took another sip. "You raising him?" "Yup," Anna said. "My daughter's figuring herself out of state. It's messy." Margaret didn't press. Anna added, "Not how I thought retirement would go, but you learn to redefine peace." Margaret looked at her. "I thought I'd faded out. Turns out I'd just gone quiet." Anna nodded. "There's a difference." Behind them, a child screamed joyfully. Someone reset the Bluetooth speaker, and a dog stole a hot dog bun. Anna laughed in honest, full sound. Margaret surprised herself by joining in. The kind of laugh that cracked open a little space in her chest. Not loud, but wide. Across the yard, Jason glanced back toward the snack table. He saw her laughing, saw the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the way her hand lightly touched her chest as if to steady herself. And for the first time, he didn't look away. He watched her like he was seeing someone new, someone who had been there all along. The drawer stuck a little. Margaret had opened it looking for old batteries. Jason's toy flashlight had died the night before, but instead found a packet of envelopes bound with twine, shoved toward the back behind a roll of masking tape, and expired coupons. She untied the bundle carefully. Most were bills. A few were lists, things to fix, things to remember, and one was a letter addressed to her in Bill's handwriting. Not on a card, not in a proper envelope, just folded paper. The edges yellowed slightly from time. She unfolded it slowly and sat down at the kitchen table. There were no greetings, no date. Just the kind of voice you only use when you're alone with a pen and the weight of everything unsaid. If you're reading this, it probably means I never gave it to you. I didn't write it to be read. I wrote it so I could breathe. You carried me longer than I deserved, through fog, through the parts of me that didn't come back, through nights I don't remember, but you never forgot. I was angry a lot, at nothing, at everything. You made space for that, and you never once asked. Me too, thank you for it. So this is my thank you. Not for staying, for not vanishing. You've always been stronger than I could ever admit. Even now, don't disappear for them. You're not just somebody's mother, you're you. And that's always been more than enough. Margaret didn't cry. She just sat, letting the letter rest on the table in front of her, fingertips barely touching the corner. The back door creaked open. Danny stepped inside, wiping his hands with a shop towel. He saw her at the table, paused. She didn't hide the paper. He walked over slowly, leaned in slightly, read a few lines without asking, then straightened. She looked up at him. Found it in the drawer, she said, her voice calm. Danny didn't speak, just nodded. He set the towel down beside her glass of water. Didn't sit, didn't walk away, just stood. And that was enough. The knock came just after dinner. Margaret was rinsing a pan, the window above the sink still catching the last streaks of dusk. The porch light hadn't even flicked on yet when she opened the door. Ethan stood there with one hand in his pocket, the other gripping a manila folder. He looked tired, not in the way of someone who needed sleep, but in the way of someone who had been rehearsing a conversation for too long. I found the insurance form you needed, he said, for Dad's old policy. She stepped aside. Come in, he did, without a word. He didn't remove his shoes, just glanced around the kitchen like he hadn't stood in it in years, which was mostly true. Margaret gestured to the table. Sit down. He hesitated, then pulled out a chair. Not the edge, not hovering near the doorway, the seat across from hers. She poured him a glass of water, set it in front of him, then sat across with nothing in her hands, not even the letter. For a while, they just sat there. He cleared his throat. Jason had a good time at the party. He said you were funny. I don't remember being funny. He said you laughed with some lady and didn't make it weird. Margaret gave a small smile. High praise. Ethan looked down at the table, fingers tapping once on the folder. I've been trying, he said, to figure out what's changed. She didn't answer right away. He went on. You single quotes different, not in a bad way, just less quiet, more certain. I don't know if that's good or if it just makes me nervous. Margaret folded her hands. That's honest. I don't mean to be the bad guy, he said. I just didn't want Jason to carry more than he had to. And you thought I was a burden. No, he said quickly. No, just old pain that I didn't want passed down. She watched him then. Calmly. You don't have to understand me to respect me. Ethan's fingers stopped tapping. I didn't disappear, she added. You just stopped looking. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. He reached for the glass, took a sip, set it back down, and sat a little straighter outside. The porch light buzzed on. The school parking lot buzzed with quiet purpose. Cardboard boxes of cleaning supplies lined the sidewalk. Plastic buckets stacked like bright-colored bells. Parents in hoodies and work gloves shuffled around folding tables, their kids chasing loose paper cups and rubber balls across the grass. Margaret walked up the front path with measured steps, canvas shoes soft against the pavement. She wore her gardening jeans, the ones with faint green stains on the thigh, and a plain navy tea-shirt. No makeup, no plan to impress. At the check-in table, a young woman in a windbreaker looked up, smiling. Hi there, name, Margaret Sullivan. The woman scanned the list. Here you are, Group 3, painting benches. She handed her a clipboard. Margaret took it without hesitation. A few feet away, a group of parents was already crouched around a stack of sandpaper and paint cans near the playground. Margaret approached, one woman, tan arms, paint already on her cheek, looked up and smiled politely. Didn't think you were the PTA type, she said, almost amused. Margaret set the clipboard down beside a can of green paint, peeled off her gloves from her back pocket, and shrugged. Neither did I, she said. Then, after a beat, turns out, I'm not. I'm just me. The woman laughed lightly. Well, just you can take this brush. Margaret took it, dipped it, and started painting the edge of a bench that had faded to near gray dot. No one gave her instructions. No one questioned her lines. She painted slowly, evenly, the sun warming her shoulders. Jason ran past at one point, holding a trash bag, a friend beside him. He didn't stop, but he did glance over. He saw her kneeling beside the bench, sleeves rolled, hands already streaked with color. She looked back just long enough to catch his eyes. Neither of them waved. Neither of them had to. The project instructions were scrawled in pencil at the top of the sheet. Create a visual timeline of your family's life story. Include at least 5 key moments. Make it personal. Jason stood in the kitchen doorway, paper in hand, looking like he'd just been assigned a prison sentence. Margaret looked up from the stove, stirring a pot of soup. What's the look? He held out the sheet. She took it, read it, then raised an eyebrow. Big ask. Jason nodded. I don't really know what counts. She studied him. And you're asking me, I guess, he said. If you're not busy? Margaret set the spoon down gently. You sure your dad's okay with that? Jason shrugged. It's not for him. That stopped her for a moment. Not because it was rebellious, but because it was honest. She wiped her hands on a towel. All right then, let's do it. They cleared the kitchen table together, moving placemats, setting out construction paper, markers, glue sticks, and a pair of scissors Margaret hadn't used since Ethan's second grade science fair. Jason chose a light blue poster board. Margaret drew a faint pencil line across the middle to mark the timeline. They started from Jason's birth. He picked that, not her, and then moved forward. First trip to the zoo. First time he rode a bike. She mentioned Bill gently. Jason paused, then nodded. We can put him, he counts. They included a picture of Margaret holding Jason at a pumpkin patch one Ethan had taken. One Jason barely remembered. Jason glued it down, smoothing the edges with his thumb. At some point, Jason said, "You're really good at this." Margaret smiled. "I had practice." He looked at her then, not like a kid checking his work, but like someone seeing the person across from him more clearly. They kept going. It got messy. A marker bled onto the wood. Glue clumped near the bottom edge, but neither of them cared. By the time they were done, the timeline was crooked, bright, and full. Just like them, the porch boards creaked gently as Margaret stepped outside, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The sun was just starting its slow descent behind the neighbor's roofline, casting a golden line across the railing. The smell of something grilled, probably Danny's doing, drifted faintly from down the block. Ethan's car was already parked at the curb. He stood by the steps, envelope in hand. She raised a brow. "Twice in 1 week," he smiled lightly. "I'm breaking records." She didn't invite him in. She didn't need to. He walked up the steps slowly, holding the envelope as if it might lose shape if he held it too tightly. "I was cleaning out Dad's old desk," he said. "In the garage, came across this." He handed it to her. She looked down. The handwriting was hers. She didn't remember writing it, but the slope of the letters was unmistakable. "It was addressed to me," Ethan said. "No stamp, just folded in with the rest." Margaret turned the envelope over. No seal. She didn't open it. "You read it?" she asked. He nodded. "I should have read it a long time ago, but maybe now was better." She waited. "Let him speak if he had more to say. I didn't realize how much of you I'd boxed away with him," he said quietly. "It was easier that way, but it wasn't right." She met his eyes. "Didn't speak." He took a breath. "You were angry in the letter, but you were also kind. You told me not to disappear just because I didn't know what to say." Margaret pressed her thumb along the edge of the envelope. "You said I didn't have to be Bill," Ethan added. "Just present." There was a silence then, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. He stepped forward, hugged her, not tightly, not dramatically, just enough. Margaret returned it, one arm around his back, the other still holding the letter. When he pulled away, she said, "You want to come in?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet, but I will." She nodded once as he turned and walked down the steps. Margaret sat on the porch swing. She didn't open the letter. She didn't need to. It had already been delivered. The shed door was propped open with a brick, warm light slanting across the floor. In golden sheets, the smell inside was all sawdust, rubber, and grease, comforting. In its own unpolished way, Danny crouched beside the bike, his socket wrench making short, decisive clicks as he tightened the last bolt on the rear axle. Margaret stood just outside, arms folded loosely, her shoulder resting against the frame of the open doorway. "Looks better than it ever did," she said. Danny didn't look up. "I'd say it's probably safer now, too." He set the wrench down, spun the back wheel slowly. It hummed even. "And smooth. I think he'll love it," she said. Danny stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's the hope." Margaret watched him, then stepped inside. The shed felt smaller with both of them in it, but not cramped. He leaned back against the workbench, arms crossed now too, mirroring her. "I'm heading out tomorrow," he said. "Truck's half packed." She nodded as if she'd known. Maybe she had. "I've got a buddy down near San Angelo who needs a hand with some roofing jobs. It's honest work." Silence passed gently between them. Danny added, "But I wanted to say goodbye properly this time." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Last time you just disappeared." "Yeah," he said. "I figured maybe you didn't mind." "I minded," she replied, but without sharpness. Danny studied her face. "Well, I stayed long enough to mean something again." Then, softer, "But I'll stay longer if you ask me to." The air shifted. Margaret didn't look away. "I won't ask you to stay." Danny nodded. "UNSURPRISED." She took one slow step forward. "But if you go, don't leave like last time." He smiled faintly. "You want a goodbye hug? Is that it?" "No," she said. "I want the truth." Danny pushed off the bench. Then, after a beat, held out his arms. Margaret stepped into them, not because she needed to, but because she chose to. The hug was quiet, familiar, nothing messy, nothing claimed. When they pulled apart, Margaret said, "Don't lose the wrench. That bike's gonna need tune-ups." Danny tapped his chest pocket. "Already packed." She stepped aside as he passed through the doorway. Neither of them looked back. They didn't need to. The pickup truck idled at the edge of the gas station lot, the sun just beginning to creep low enough to set the telephone poles stretching long. Shadows across the road, Margaret stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, a light breeze pulling at the edge of her collar. Danny leaned against the driver's side door, squinting at the horizon. Neither had said much on the walk from the house. It had been the kind of silence that didn't need filling. "You got snacks?" she asked. He patted the cooler in the bed. "I'm a grown man. I pack cheese sticks now." She smirked. So civilized, he grinned. Then, quieter, "You're really not going to ask me to stay?" Margaret looked at him, the corners of her mouth calm. That was never mine to ask. Danny's eyes softened, but he didn't argue. She stepped closer. "If you're right," she said. "Don't apologize." He raised an eyebrow. "For what? For going? For leaving? For anything?" He nodded slowly. She added, "Just tell me something true." Danny looked at her for a long second, then reached out his hand. She took it. It wasn't a handshake. It wasn't a grasp. It was something in between. Solid, clear. Enough. But then he tugged her into a hug. Brief. Firm. His hand steady against her back. When they stepped apart, he opened the door and climbed in. The engine rattled once, then steadied. He rolled the window down halfway. "Take care of the kid," he said. Margaret nodded. "You too." And with that, the truck pulled out, wheels crunching on gravel, then rolling clean onto the paved road. She didn't watch it disappear. She turned before it crested the hill and walked home with her head up. Margaret was sweeping the living room. When she heard the door creak open, Jason stepped in quietly, his backpack hanging low on one shoulder, a square package tucked under one arm, wrapped in brown paper with tape pulled slightly askew. She set the broom aside. He walked up to her, handed it over without preamble. "Here." She turned the package over once in her hands, then peeled the paper back slowly. Inside was a small shadow box, plain wood. No glass, just enough depth to hold a single object. The bird, her felt bird, still crooked at the seams, ribbon curling a bit at the tip, now pinned carefully to a backing of soft linen, as if it had always belonged there. "So it doesn't get crushed in your purse," Jason said, his voice quiet but sure. Margaret looked at it for a long time, then looked at him. She opened her mouth to speak but stopped. She didn't need to. Jason shrugged, like it was nothing, then turned slightly. "I thought it should go on the shelf, next to Grandpa's photo." She nodded. He walked over to the bookshelf near the TV, the one they never used much, except for things too old to toss and too important to hide. He cleared a space between a silver frame and a smooth river rock Bill had once brought back from the coast, then placed the box. The bird sat steady, upright, like it had landed there on purpose. Jason looked at it, then at her, and smiled. Margaret smiled back, smaller, but deeper. No fuss. No thank you speech. No commentary on symbolism. Just a look, like he understood what he was giving her, and she understood what she'd given him. The coffee steamed gently in her mug, the ceramic still warm against her palms. Margaret sat on the porch swing, one leg crossed over the other, a blanket draped casually over her lap, even though the spring air was already soft and rising. The sun hadn't climbed high, yet it slanted across the neighbor's roof like a slow yawn. Bright but unhurried. Birdsong floated from the hedge across the lawn, sharp and short, then quiet again. No one else was awake yet. No one calling her name. No questions to answer. Just the creak of the swing. The weight of her own breath on the table beside her sat a folded letter, bills next to it. The newspaper, unread. She wasn't waiting for anything. Not anymore. Not an apology. Not a phone call. Not even for someone to say, "You matter." She already knew. Not loudly. Not in headlines. But in small things, the bike in the garage with its tightened bolts, the framed bird on the shelf, the boy who had started calling her grandma again, not like a role, but like a name. Margaret took another sip of coffee. A breeze stirred the porch curtain. She leaned back against the cushion, closed her eyes not to drift off. Not to relive anything, just to rest. Here, exactly as she was.